Hello, in this video, I want to continue our series that we've started talking about Deleuze and Guattari in relationship to the worker strike. This has been a really interesting series, and I definitely think that if it's your first time really hearing like Deleuze and Guattari in relationship to the worker strike resolution coming up for LD in the next couple months, I definitely would say you should look at the last couple videos that I did, whether it be the intro to Deleuze and Guattari on the worker strike resolution or the DNG Part 1, DNG Part 2 videos, because both of those are really important to kind of understand what I think it kind of looks like as a core negative strategy or as a core negative criticism. And so now I definitely want you all to think a little bit more about like how policy teams give it our answers argument, both if you're trying to like beat policy teams and trying to figure out what their best strategies are against the argument, or if you're a policy team trying to develop a better strategy. I think that this video will be helpful, and you should definitely look at the last video that I did because it will kind of directly pull on from that conversation from there. In the last video, we talked a little bit about like what some of the priorities are versus this argument, and just like what some of the central like framing and thesis concerns are to kind of like start structuring the kind of like meta portion of the argument that you want to have in order for you to be able to really have a much more easier time handling the more formal parts of the debate, which we'll be talking about in this video when discussing a little bit more about what it looks like on the link debate, the permutation debate, impact comparison, and alternative debating. I definitely think it's still important to like watch some stuff of that video because a lot of the conversations we were having about how you should kind of be like pushing the pace on like your impact calculus from the beginning of the debate, and why it's really important to kind of like answer some of the thesis concerns from the other team are really important to the stuff that we'll kind of be considering in this video. And in this video, I want to start just talking a little bit about what I think about the link debate as a whole. I think that when you're kind of just considering what the link debate is really supposed to do, or what the best way to kind of like think about how you should be beating the link arguments on this, are definitely a couple of options. I think there are really diverse ways to really answer this if you're reading an argument that just straight up endorses the recognition of a worker strike by the United States federal government or by like the government in general. And I think that the first thing is first to kind of like think about the difference between the affirmative and the alternative in a world where the status quo is kind of like remain in place. So like for instance, if they're able to like win their link argument and the affirmative doesn't happen, what types of barriers still exist in a world of the alternative that make it impossible for them to solve the impact to the link argument, and why does that mean that the judge should be preferring the affirmative instead, even if it's not able to fully get out of all the merits of the link argument? The second thing is that you really want to apply a lot of the pressure that you've kind of already made from this thesis arguments that we made before. I feel like a lot of the arguments that the team really has to make in order to make their link arguments make sense are really pushing this argument about why the war machine has to kind of be in this antagonistic relationship to the state. And I feel like a lot of the thesis concerns that we've been talking about in terms of how you're able to push like why the particular way in which you're thinking about a history means that like things like crackdown, etc., makes it a lot harder to kind of solve for these things like proximately, but also still kind of like hammering down on why things like assemblers theory can't really explain the way in which you're relating to institutions at a really precise kind of like legal level. And I think that being able to make arguments about that can really kind of like hurt the top level kind of like assumptions that the evidence that they might be reading is making about like how politics is functioning as a whole, and therefore your investment into like whatever they're kind of like saying is violent might not be the same as what you're kind of like making the stuff out to be via the way in which you're kind of like indicating the difference between how you're thinking about the world post-affirmative and their consideration of the world in the way that it is now. I feel like a lot of the arguments that people want to make in terms of like environmental arguments, disease-based arguments, or just worker strike arguments in general are just about like passive forms of state managerialism and how the state like consumes kind of radical energy, etc. And I feel like the arguments that you really want to make are link turn arguments about how you kind of like supercharge or make possible various forms of resistance against the state that kind of allow you to really like make kind of like different forms of resistance possible, even if they're not all locused around like legal change, and how like the 1AC is able to spill over into different paradigms of like how we're thinking about changing violence. I think that when you transition this and like how you're able to make like better permutation arguments, I think that this is really just an example portion of the debate, and it's a question of how much you want to spend time really developing the examples that you get at present in the debate. I feel like a lot of the arguments that are best made on the permutation for this argument are just like what are examples of like what they could cite as war machines that have eventually kind of like had to come in contact with the state, or there is kind of like this like nature or relationship that has been drawn between those movements and the state that make it a lot harder to think about a world where that has made it a lot harder to think about a world where there's a way in which the state is able to like be able to allow these movements to operate independently without there being some type of like crackdown, etc., and then being able to do things like, for instance, weigh a lot of the impact comparison that's kind of started in the framing debate above about why, if they're right about like why there need to be like war machines that are always made antagonistic to the state, that isn't the same of like every type of militaristic movement, and the way in which the the kind of like 1AC can kind of work along a paradigm to be able to like resolve some of the concerns that they're having about the differences between the permutation and the alternative. I feel like a lot of the ways that you can resolve those differences is by winning that like there can be movements that exist outside of the state, or that there can be ways in which movements can refuse to be kind of encompassed in the state, but that only makes it more necessary that there are kind of like modes of ways of engaging the state that are precise and like legally accurate. And that's kind of like where your right filler arguments and your arguments about like how the state kind of becomes inevitable at some other levels become really, really important. I then think that when you transition into the impact comparison portion of the debate, you really want to push the pace on like why the kind of like material impacts that you're saying have a lot of proximate cause to a lot of like the systems of violence that the other team will kind of be discussing. I feel like as a negative team, like I kind of said in the last couple videos when I was talking about what this looks like as a negative criticism, I was kind of advising a lot of critical teams to try to like get to making their impacts as material as possible by being able to win at the kind of structural critiques that they're making about like the relationships between institutions, various types of subject formation, etc., and the identity grid, and the way in which the state kind of like territorializes various forms of space. I think make it really good arguments to like turn into like arguments about like gentrification, or arguments about the ways in which various other material impacts are kind of like implicated from the paradigm that the state is using to continue to consume other radical movements and the like continual consumption of war machines. But I feel like the argument that you can kind of make is that if you win that kind of process is an inevitable paradigm that the state takes up, then it's a question of ways in which you can weaponize that against the state and find ways to sabotage it. And I think that there are a lot of really interesting articles or authors that are really writing in the vein of like what sabotaging the state really looks like, from like the type of kind of like legal preciseness that is created under the paradigm of the affirmative. I then think that when you get to the alternative, it's just all about creating different barriers and forms of arguments that are able to show why there are so many material implications that the alternative can't solve back for if it continually refuses the state, and making arguments about like why this on the kind of like failure of the alternative to be able to overcome these barriers only prove the inevitability of these arguments that we've been talking about throughout the video. And it allows you to kind of like finish it in this kind of like loop where your framing argument is kind of setting up a lot of the places where you really want to indict them on the rest of the portion of the flow, and your alternative seems your answers to the alternative seems a lot more offensive because of the way in which they're compacted from the various ways that you're kind of strategizing the flow earlier on. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing talking about D&G and various other things on the workers' strike topic. And yeah, thanks as always.